Welcome to the final segment in the federal judicial system. Now we're going to take time and look at the courts and the public policy that they shape and influence. Historically, the courts both reflect and help determine the national policy agenda. And until the Civil War, the dominant questions before the court simply regarded the strength and legitimacy of the federal government and slavery. From the Civil War until 1937, questions of the relationship between the federal government and the economy were predominant, and the courts traditionally favored corporations, especially when the government tried to regulate them. From 1938 to the present, the predominant issues before the Supreme Court have concerned personal liberties and social and political equality. It's very important to trace the court's use of judicial review in major policy battles in various eras of American history. And as you can see on the chart or on the slide here, these are the 5 eras of the Supreme Court that are probably the most important to Supreme Court decisions, and we'll look at each one in detail. So the first Supreme Court era that we're going to look at is the Marshall Court. John Marshall, Chief Justice, back in 1801 to 1835, established the Supreme Court's power of judicial review in the court case Marbury versus Madison. And as you know, the power of judicial review kind of sets the judicial branch apart from the other 2 major federal government branches and gives the court an extremely high amount of power to declare acts of Congress or the president as constitutional or unconstitutional, which can change the course of how the executive and legislative branches operate. The Court of the 9 Old Men occurred when Franklin Roosevelt entered the White House. The court was dominated by conservatives who viewed federal intervention in the economy as unconstitutional and tantamount to socialism. In 1937, Roosevelt proposed what critics called a court-packing plan, in which he proposed that Congress expand the size of the court, which would allow him to appoint additional justices that were sympathetic to his New Deal. And although Congress never passed the plan, 2 justices began switching their votes in favor of a New Deal legislation, a transformation that was called the switch in time that saved 9, which means for them to switch their votes to a more liberal position, it allowed them to save the 9 justices that were on the court and not have any more appointed. The Supreme Court in the United States is incredibly unique in comparison to that of other countries. As you can see, different countries have set term limits on their justices, their Supreme Court judges. Okay, now let's move to the Warren Court. The Warren Court, few eras of the Supreme Court have been as active in shaping public policy as that of the Warren Court. They are responsible for Brown versus Board of Education, and the court's decisions on things like desegregation, criminal defendants' rights, and voting reapportionment led to calls from white right-wing groups for the impeachment of Justice Earl Warren. The critics argued that the unelected justices were making policy decisions that were the responsibility of the elected officials themselves. Then you move on to the Burger Court of the 1970s. I know, I should learn to do these lectures at home so as not to get mixed up by the bell. The Burger Court of the 1970s was more conservative than the liberal Warren Court, but didn't overturn the due process protections that the Warren era had established. The Burger Court is responsible for the abortion decision in Roe versus Wade. They're also responsible for the requirement that school busing in certain cases to eliminate historic segregation, and they also upheld affirmative action programs. The Warren Court is also responsible for the decision in the U.S. versus Nixon case. The final court that we're going to look at is the Rehnquist and Roberts Court. Roberts is currently on the Supreme Court. The Rehnquist Court has created a revolution in constitutional law. Instead, they have not created a revolution in constitutional law. That one term makes a big difference. Instead, it has slowly been chipping away at liberal decisions, such as those regarding defendants' rights, abortion, and affirmative action. They're responsible for the Bush versus Gore decision, as well as the McDonald versus Chicago. As you can see, Supreme Court justices and the number of conservatives and liberals can change public policy.